Okay, we've come to the part of the day where we're going to talk about some economic issues and public policy issues, hearing from the social science side of the house, looking at the sort of possible futures and so forth. So we're going to start today. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Peter Hartley, who is the chairman of our economics department here at Rice.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm going to discuss two things here in my presentation. It's not just solar, as is advertised in the handout, but solar and high voltage direct current transmission. And those of you who have heard me talk before know that I'm quite interested in the transmission part of this equation, and in fact more of my talk, as it turns out, is going to be focused on the transmission question, and because I think that there's something quite interesting that comes out of this analysis that we've done. I should comment too, by the way, that this is joint work with Kenneth Medlock, who's a research fellow at the Baker Institute. And I also got some numbers from Bob Brito, but neither of those two characters are going to, should take any responsibility for the arithmetical and other errors in here because they haven't had a chance to review. Okay. So, key idea in this talk is that I'm going to propose that what we should do is something concrete, focus on a demonstration project for new electricity technologies in the US Southwest, specifically. The two technologies I'm going to talk about are a grid-connected PV solar power plant, 250 megawatts is the one that we looked at in the paper, and then high-voltage direct current transmission using nanowire technology to transmit the electricity from that plant to both Texas and California. And why this location? Well, the southwest climate in the US is favourable for producing solar electricity. And, but more importantly, from the economic point of view, we've got two large electricity markets nearby, the Southwest, California and Texas. And I'm going to show you that market opportunities actually would allow us to build this project, I think, at a relatively low cost, and it would be a great demonstration project. At least that's the proposition. As I mentioned, I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the transmission project. I've called it the nanowire project alone. And then I'm going to add on the solar plant at the end. So the nanowire project is just to build a new high voltage direct current link between California, specifically Los Angeles, and Texas, specifically Dallas. And at the theoretical level, there's other sort of reasons for thinking this is a good project before you actually look at any numbers. Texas ERCOT is the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas. Basically all of the state of Texas is under the ERCOT system. And one fact about the Texas system is that it's only weakly connected to the surrounding North American transmission regions. And that is one reason, I think, why there are some opportunities here to make money, as I'll show you with some pictures down the track. Texas also, it turns out, currently has substantial generating capacity, and that enables, in certain times of the day at least, for electricity to be transported profitably in the opposite direction to California. Another thing is that another reason why you can also make money sending electricity to California from Texas is that California has, at the moment, a relatively smaller reserve plant margin. So at certain times of the day, you can actually sell electricity for a lot of money in California. And another difference between the two states is that California has a lot more hydro capacity, or access to hydro capacity, than Texas does. And so for certain seasons of the year, that also means you can make money shipping electricity from the West Coast to Texas. The seasonal weather pattern, as we know, also differs between Texas and California. When we have the high demand months for air conditioning and so on is different. And then another key point is that Texas and California have a time difference which gives them what we call non-coincident daily peaks, which also provides market opportunities. And it turns out a lot of other North American transmission links actually are north-south. This would be a major east-west one. And another interesting fact about Texas and California is just given the way the time zones are set up, Houston is only 1 hour behind the East Coast, but 2 hours ahead of the West Coast. Actually, an interesting fact that implies is that the time distance between Texas and California is actually relatively small compared with the physical distance, which makes this a nice thing. This is the proposed route for the link we're talking about. And there's 3 segments to the link. Now, one fact about this is that you can build this link using 3 existing rights-of-way. So the orange link in Texas is actually a right-of-way that's already owned by PG&E. The one in the middle is a link that would follow the El Paso South gas pipeline. And then over in California, you'd follow the SoCal gas pipeline. So an advantage of this is using existing rights-of-way, you could get, probably do the project much more quickly, much more cheaply. Of course, you'd require cooperation of these 3 entities to do it. Presumably, you'd form a consortium of them, or they'd give them a cut of the apple, or cut of the pie. Cut of the apple pie, yes. And then the other interesting fact is the 2 existing links into California, the black lines on the left, they're 2 existing high voltage direct current links into California. As it so happens, they also go along gas pipeline rights-of-way. One of them SoCal, and the other one PGT and PG&E pipeline systems. So there's a precedent actually for using gas pipelines for your rights-of-way. So it would be great for this project. And what we're going to do later on, of course, is there in southern Arizona, we're going to talk about putting our solar power plant. Now, I'm going to look at contrast the conventional high voltage direct current transmission link with an alternative, which, well, first bullet point there, first of all, is to note that it's only direct current that's the only feasible alternative here, because the link between California and Texas has to be asynchronous. Right? These 2 systems aren't cycling together, so you'd have to have a direct current link anyway. But also, given the distance and the amount of power you want to transmit, it turns out that high voltage direct current actually beats an AC link. But then, so that's the first justification for going HVDC. Second point here is, though, that I'm going to talk about using quantum wire, and the numbers I'm going to use come from the people here at Rice. So, these are some points in the paper that they shared with me. I hope they don't mind me. Me doing this, right? I guess the horse is bolted anyway. So. So anyway, this quantum wire has better conductivity than standard and proposed composite conductors, near zero thermal expansion, which eliminates sag failure, 30% less weight, saving on the cost of tower structures and the right-of-way, and 10 times better tensile strength, which allows longer spans, saving on tower costs. And I'll show you how that comes into the calculations. So what's the market opportunity I'm talking about? Actually, to evaluate this, ideally, you'd want to have a model where you project forward in the demand growth and you project forward investments and so on. And in fact, in the energy program here at Rice, we have the capability to do that. And indeed, I think it would be an interesting exercise to do. But for this particular presentation, we didn't build such a complete model looking forward to all the investment. So for this exercise, what we did was we went back to 2003, so we had a full year of data. And then we looked at hourly wholesale prices for electricity. So we've got actual market prices in North Texas, that's the Dallas area, and Southern California, the LA area. And the system loads in the 2 areas for every hour in 2003. And the question then is, given those market prices and the cost of shipping electricity from the one end to the other, how much money could we make? And how does that compare with the cost of putting in the wire? That's the basic question, very practical kind of question here. Basically, sufficiently large differentials provide us with an opportunity to make money. Can we make enough to pay for the wire? Actually, this analysis is going to ignore some other potential benefits from having such a wire. In particular, in both California and Texas, there's a market for ancillary services, which are, sort of emergency generating services or emergency input into the system. And if you had such a wire, you could provide those services and make money from them. We haven't costed those. So this is going to be a conservative estimate of the amount of money you could make. Another issue to take into account is if you start buying electricity in California and selling it in Texas, you're going to tend to drive up the price of electricity in California and drive it down in Texas and vice versa. And we want to take that into account. And so what we did was we took that into account by looking at the load and relating the market price, the wholesale market price, to the system load, and estimated a function which relates that, and using that function you can figure out an estimate of how much buying electricity would drive up the prices and how much selling it would drive them down. And this relies on the fact that in the very short run, hour to hour, or actually 15 minutes or 10 minutes in these two systems, the price movements are dominated by the increasing cost of supply. Okay, so here's a picture of the differentials. So here's the Texas price minus the California price for every hour of 2003. And what you can see from that picture is, this is dollars per megawatt hour. And so you have some big spikes there above $800. Actually, you notice that the spikes are more on the upside than the downside. That reflects the fact, I believe, as I've argued before, that Texas is actually much more weakly connected to the rest of the system than California is. So when there's a crisis, when there's a problem here, like a plant goes down, that's usually what causes these spikes. So we have some generator fails or some transmission link fails, something like that, so you have to bring on very expensive generating capacity to make up for the failure. In Texas, there's not a lot of depth to the market, so you have a big spike in prices. And California, you also have a spike. They're the downward ones because it's Texas minus California, but they're not nearly as big because it's a better connected system. You can draw on a lot of resources in the surrounding states, and also all the hydro. Actually, the hydroelectricity is the other thing that leads to this. Having access to hydro, which is stored electricity, you can smooth out these jumps much better than you can in a system that has a lot less hydro. So the asymmetry in the spikes also reflect the difference in hydro resources available in the two states. Okay, so anyway, we're going to exploit this difference in prices to make money. That's the idea. Just by way of explaining too, the reason why this is the sort of rank order of the plants. And one thing you find there is that the guys who, this sort of gives you an idea of how much you have to be paid to supply electricity on an emergency basis. The negative prices mean if you're a nuclear plant, under no circumstances do I really want to vary my output, essentially, you know. So I'll go backwards, but only if you pay me a huge amount of money. Okay, so what we did though was, as I said, we used the data to estimate these curves. So these curves reflect how much prices will rise as you change the load on the system. The leftmost picture is California. That's a system hourly load in gigawatt hours, and the right-hand side is Texas. Actually, we estimated these two functions, and from the R-squared, these nonlinear functions, you can see fit quite well the data price. R-squared, 80% of the variation explained in California, 96% in Texas. And then underneath that function is the derivative. We want that derivative of the function so that, you know, because the idea here is going to be when we got this wire in place and we try to buy electricity in California, it's going to drive up the load on the system and drive up prices. We use this function to tell us how much it's going to drive up the price. And when we sell in Texas, again, we're going to drive down the price in Texas, and we use this function to tell us. So we want the derivative. We're going to use the derivative of the function to approximate how much the prices are going to move when I try to buy or sell electricity. For the sake of argument, we're going to have a 1 gigawatt capacity line with a length of 2,000 kilometres, which is basically the distance between LA and Dallas. And using conventional technology now, a high voltage direct current line, optimised line with these parameters, you'd have a loss of about 13% on the line. And I got my source there before we got that. And of course, as I mentioned, we had this paper from the CNL which argued that the losses on a quantum wire would be about 1/10 of that. Well, I'm going to say, okay, let's take 1.5%. So instead of 1.3. And with 1.5% loss, to sell a gigawatt, you have to buy actually 1.01523 gigawatts in the other market. If the current selling price is PS and the current buying price is PB, assume the new prices are going to be given by the derivative, like I mentioned. And so the money you can make, therefore, is the new selling price minus the new buying price, and then you have to buy more than you sell. So that's the one. So the loss comes into this equation in two places. Comes in because the higher the loss, the more you've got to buy for each amount you sell. So that costs you more money. And on top of that, when you're buying more, of course, it drives up the price more. So you get sort of the square of the loss coming in here in terms of the revenue. So cutting down the losses is worth quite a bit, and I'll show you that. It's going to be worth a lot. Okay, so given that calculation, you can look at the amount of money you make per hour, and you can either go California to Texas, or you can go Texas to California, or you can do nothing. So, of course, you'll do the max of those three things each hour. And it turns out you do nothing for about 19% of the hours using 2003 data. It's not worth shipping power because the prices are too similar relative to the losses. Again, this is on the quantum wire. The mean amount of money you make, though, is $17,174 an hour. That's the average for 8,760 hours, $17,000 an hour. That's you know, we're going to see, that's not small bickies, right? Down there we got the present value, actually, of that. So at 6.5% discount rate, you can actually discount back at an hourly discount rate. So this is discounting all the way back to January 1. The present value of that is actually $146 million each year. For a 30-year project, let's say, if you've got this wire in for 30 years, what that gives you $1.9 billion. And there's a histogram of on the left down the bottom of the amount of money you're going to make per hour. I'm restricted below 100 so you can see what's going on. The big spike at 0 is where you're not using the wire. And on the right-hand side is actually the money you're making each hour of 2003. Actually, this is not we estimated a model of this to look at the properties of this money you're making. If you're going to do this into Texas or California, you have to have some idea of the time pattern of money that you're going to make, because you have to do a deal. At least in the Texas system, you've got to put in a balanced, what they call a balanced load into the system. So you'd have to know this. But the details are not important. One thing you could do with this model, though, is use it to simulate forward. Okay, so you don't just use 2003, but you use in a whole bunch of years that look, quote, sort of like 2003. One thing that is of interest from that model is here's the time of day pattern of making money, and the green line is the maximum amount, and you can see it goes from, this is in thousands of dollars on the left. So I told you the average was 17,000. On Sunday in May, that's the green line. You're making from 25,000 there in the middle of the night, falls down closer to 15 in the middle of the day, and then back up to closer to 25, above 20 again as you get back towards the night again. Of course, as you go down, the orange line, I mean the negatives, you wouldn't, you know, 0 is greater than that. So some of these times, that's the times when you wouldn't be using the wire. But that gives you an idea. Well, actually, a lot of the money, interestingly enough, a lot of the money here you're making is in the middle of the night. So the prices are different between Texas and California more often in the middle of the night. So just making money out of arbitrage, you do a lot. In the middle of the day, you're not using the wire a lot to arbitrage prices. That means you could use it to ship your solar power. So it sort of fits nicely with putting solar in here in the middle of the afternoon to fill in that little trough. Okay, so we want to go through and calculate, we want to compare, actually what this slide does is compares conventional HDC, high voltage DC, with our nanowire. So as I mentioned before, if you've got higher loss, you're going to drive up prices more and drive up prices more when you try to buy. And also, of course, you're going to lose more along the wire. You're also going to have to spend more on the system because you have to have a higher capacity wire to be able to sell the same gigawatt. Okay, well, if you had with 13% loss instead of 1.5%, you actually have $0 for around 34% of the time instead of 19%. So you don't get to use your wire for a lot more of the time. So that's what one thing that lower resistance brings you. Plus the mean falls to $14,532 instead of what it was before. And the discounted present value now falls to 1.6 billion instead of 1.9. So you lose 300 million. So essentially, even if the nanowire, given the specifications I gave, if it cost an extra 300 million to put in, despite all these other savings we're going to talk about, it'd still be worth doing because over conventional high voltage DC. Okay, so let's go back now to our nanowire one. So that was just by comparison with the conventional. Okay, how about the net present value of the high voltage direct current nanowire link? We have to put in 2 converter stations, and the current going price for those is 215 million each. If we look at the cost of conventional line, using data available at the EIA website, you come out with a number of 444 million, but as I mentioned, that's going to be more expensive than our nanowire, regardless of the cost of the nanowire. I'm not taking that into account. I don't know how much that's going to cost. But with 10 times higher tensile strength, lesser tendency to sag, and less weight, as I talked about, it should allow longer spans in the transmission system, fewer towers and smaller towers. Let's suppose we get line costs, that saves us a lot, we get 50%. What does that do? Ignoring, and again here I've ignored taxes, depreciation and the right-of-way costs, the surplus is perhaps 1.25 billion. So that could pay for a little bit of lot of extra add-ons I haven't talked about here. Okay, so now what we're going to do is thinking about adding our solar plant to that, PV plant. As I mentioned, arbitrage profits tend to be lowest mid to late afternoon Central Time. Solar plant in Arizona would supply additional low-cost power at those times. So what we're going to do, just for argument's sake, is let's suppose the plant's in Tucson, Arizona, where they've had a little bit of experience at these kinds of things, as we heard this morning. And using data from the NREL labs for 1990 to represent output from the plant in Tucson. And we're using panels tilted at latitude minus 15 degrees. And if we had a maximum capacity 250 megawatt plant, in 1990 this is actually what you would have gotten in terms of gigawatts. So, so it's the output of the maximum output you get is 0.25 gigawatts. Actually, these lines should go all the way to 0 at night time, of course. My program drew lines that are a bit thick. So, because I've got 8,760 things I'm plotting on this axis, right? So this is every hour the amount you would have gotten in 1990 in terms of solar output. Most of the ups and downs, as I say, at night time. There's some in the middle there, big gashes in the middle. Presumably it was a cloudy day, right there. Okay, so we've got to split these 1.5% losses on our nanowire. Because it's in Arizona, and I want to keep the total loss at 1.5%. I basically split it 0.5% getting to California, 1% getting to Texas from Arizona. The little extra in there is because I want actually to still be just exactly, close to 1.5%. The point about this is, of course, when the solar plant's generating, to sell power in Texas, you don't have to buy in California, you get it for nothing. And conversely, if the solar plant's generating and you want to sell power in California, you don't have to buy it for Texas, you get it for nothing. So the amount you've got to buy is what the solar plant's generating minus what you want, what you need to sell. On top of that, these periods when the wire wasn't being used at all for arbitraging prices, some of those periods the solar plant may be generating electricity, and then you can sell it either this way or that way depending on which way you make more money. So what we did was take that profile of output from the solar plant, assume it's there on the wire, and see how much money we can make when we add in the solar plant. And now revenue is $0 for only around 8.6% of the hours. You actually be using your line 91.4% of the time. And the mean now return per hour has gone up to $19,000. And you can see this is what the new distribution looks like. And there's the new time series model. And there's the new time profile, expected time profile. And now you can see how the solar plant is filling in that dip there in the middle of the afternoon. Right? So your profits, your revenue doesn't fall nearly as much in the middle of the afternoon as it did before. What happens now is that we make now $161.84 million a year. Present value of the 30-year project now rises to $2.1 billion. And the difference due to the solar here is $204 million. So the addition of the solar plant gives us an extra $204 million in revenue. Now how about the costs? So this is where I was talking to Bob about the costs. And we've assumed here $85 a metre squared. We heard this morning that they're hoping to get that down to $35, right? So So that'll more than halve this number. So the panels alone on that number would have cost you 100. And by the way, I assumed an efficiency of 10%. So we also heard this morning, if the efficiency goes up to 13%, you'll need fewer square metres of panels. So assuming 10% efficiency and $85 installed cost per square metre, costs you $192.8 million. So if we more than halve that cost of the panels, that'll take that down to, 90 million? And you will more than halve for two reasons, right? Because of the increased efficiency as well as the lower cost. And then I've taken the balancer system at $35 per square metre, but actually it may be less than that because you're hooking into a DC system and the solar is producing DC. But I didn't have enough time to get information on how much that would save me. But anyway, those two things together give you 270 million, which puts you 70 million out of pocket on the solar addition, but, you know, as a demonstration project, it may not be so bad. And then, of course, I haven't got the land cost, but then I don't think it's going to cost you a whole lot for land in Arizona. And again, I haven't got tax and depreciation considerations. Final comments. First thing we learned from this little exercise, the high voltage direct current link to arbitrage price differences between Texas and California looks like a winner. A more complete analysis taking account of likely future investment and load growth could be undertaken. As I mentioned, you know, we've got methods to do that. But apart from it being a winner economically, such a project may also allow a test of the quantum wire concept at little or no net cost. And then another nice thing about this is once you've got this wire in, perhaps another thing you could do is you could hook in wind resources from West Texas. At the moment, there's a lot of wind resources in West Texas that aren't being developed because they can't get the power to Dallas and Houston. You just hook them into this wire, so you could add that. And of course, they'd have a different time pattern of load profile than the solar. And so you'd want to look into that and include them. There's data on that available too. I just didn't have time to include that, but one could do that. In the short term, subsidising a small solar plant to connect to the line would allow for further testing of new technologies, and having the high voltage direct current link in place would make it easier to introduce solar even on a grand scale in the southwest when the cost falls. So I think that's another reason why it would be a great project to go ahead with. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to ask Shirley to bring that to Governor Richardson and move on to the next speaker. Dr. Dagobert Brito, who is the Peterkin Professor of Political Economy here at Rice.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you for inviting me. This is based. Sorry, microphone. Do you have?
Yes, let me go ahead.
Yeah, because I'm not good at staying still.
We are ready for you.
Okay.
Let me go ahead and get this on a good spot here. Are you going to need to get to your pen there?
Oh, my, I got it. Okay.
I'll turn that on.
Okay, thank you. This is a project I'm doing with Juan Rosellon. It's based on two papers we've written. One was supported by the Baker Institute way back in 99, 2000, and the other was supported by CONACYT, which is the Mexican equivalent of NSF. What I'm doing is I'm trying to update the results of the papers, and I'm changing my talk completely because lots of what I was going to say has already been said. So a lot of my slides are redundant. Now, how do I run this thing? Okay. Well, this is a long story. It started out about 1998. My field of interest really is security and arms control, and I started worrying about the Middle East. So I went to Ed and asked him, would he give me a few $1,000s to start a project on solar, because solar might be a reasonable alternative to fuel for the Middle East. I had no idea what was going on, so Ed gave me some money, and I started reading. And that's when I met Ken. And I got pushed, learned about thin films, and I read the literature, and went up to Perry, Ohio, and visited the first solar plant. And walked through it. I saw solar technology. Went to Prescott, Arizona, to True North, and they gave me all the numbers, which they probably regret. So I then computed a cost curve using sort of economic data. I had numbers to the level of how many man hours it takes to pack a cell, square meters of glass and everything. And I computed a cost curve, which I'll show you. And then I realized that, at least given the numbers I had gotten at the time, that solar would be competitive with natural gas at a price of natural gas between $2.50 and $3 a thousand. Okay, and at that point, everyone I knew started asking, well, if it's competitive, why aren't people doing it? The market should be doing it. At the risk of name dropping, I called Ken Arrow, who is a friend, and sort of sometimes I bounce ideas off, and he asked the same question, well, why aren't they doing it? Well, my answer to Ken was, it's in your book, Limits of Organization. The problem with the solar is so new that it's not going to be picked up because there's basically not institutional knowledge. Well, that was wrong too. So what are the possible reasons? And so the question I asked before I pushed solar is, why don't we have it now? And one is uncertainty as to prices and cost. Back when I was doing this, I had some projections what I thought the cost would be, and there were some projections about the cost of natural gas. And as we'll see, they're both wrong. Second is there's just complete lack of institutional knowledge in government about solar. I don't know how many times we've been here, and then Peter teases me that somebody from Berkeley, Livermore Labs, or some outfit pushing some technology will say solar will never work because it'll take up so much of the land in the country. And we've done the calculations. I decided as part of this project, and I will show you this, figure out how much land it would take to produce all the electricity used in the United States and compare it to the amount of land that's being used to produce ethanol. So I think that's good for a giggle. Third is bureaucratic inertia. That's come up before. Basically, if people don't know about it, it's hard to push, lack of knowledge. And second, solar has gotten a reputation of being a tree hugger technology, and there aren't that many people who are going to put their career on the line and push solar. There isn't going to be some young deputy assistant secretary of energy who's going to go out there and become the advocate of solar in the energy department. That would probably be a career killer. Third, it's not until recently that we got Professor Smalley involved, an exciting research topic. When I first started looking at this and reading the scientific papers on solar, except for Williams at Princeton, all the papers I could find were really second and third rate schools. I really couldn't find much, at least on Google, about people who are doing path-breaking innovative research on solar. It wasn't, top of the line for physicists or engineers to work on solar. So there wasn't much attention being paid to it. And finally, this is where the economist comes in. There are two other issues. One is market structure. To produce solar panels at a level where they become economically competitive requires huge economies of scale. And you need a market structure that has that demand. At the risk of going through the lunchtime conversation, I don't think 1 million solar roofs is the answer. And finally, there's appropriate cost of capital. Most of solar is very capital intensive. Most of the costs are capital. And talking to friends of mine who are investment bankers, they don't look at projects that, don't have a 15% rate of return. If you start looking at 15% rate of return, you'll never sell solar. If you can get the cost of capital down to 6.5, which is pretty close to the social rate of return, then solar becomes much more competitive. Okay, well, that's the outline of the paper. Page down. Okay. First, uncertainty as to cost. When I first looked at this in 91, this was the Department of Energy's forecast on price of natural gas. They thought, well, what are we, 204? We thought we'd pay, about $3 a thousand on the high side for 1,000 cubic feet. And it was going to go up and then maybe stabilize somewhere in the $4 if you were pessimistic, around 3-something if you're optimistic. But in 1990, sorry, in 2000, I'm getting old. You know, if you're looking at the price of natural gas, solar wouldn't seem very attractive. You know, it'd be a marginal. You'd go in there, take technological risk against the price of natural gas, you know, between $4 and $3. Well, just for funsies, I had a friend of mine in the energy business get some prices for me, and yesterday, a November contract for 1,000 cubic feet was $6.71. A December contract was $8. A January contract was $8.71. There's a $1.40 discount because all the storage facilities are full. So if you have natural gas on hand, you actually have to discount it because you have no place to put it. But basically, compare this with DOE. There's so much uncertainty that you wonder whether the technology is marginal, whether anyone would take the risk of investing in solar cells, a solar farm, when it's marginal. So unless there's some guarantee to encourage the initial innovation, it won't happen. Okay, so what was our forecast? Well, I think it was 2001, using the first solar data, we were basically forecasting 2.9 cents per kilowatt hour could be done with electricity. Our current forecast, again, taking the first solar model, is about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. This is at the busbar, solar field, $35 per meter balance of systems. It could be less. But anyway, we couldn't predict. I mean, we made a mistake. And so, because we were expecting for solar to be producing 1 million square meters a year on that plant. And it turns out they had a bottleneck. Ken, correct me if I'm wrong. But somehow the process that distributed the layers wasn't working correctly, and it was giving you bad distribution on the edges. So they cut down the process, and then the process of fixing this up, and it's something like a $20 million fix. So it's not like a whole lot of money in the real world, but in the solar world, it was a third of the solar energy budget. Yeah, but it's also less than the cost of a fighter plane, to put things in perspective. So we were off. Okay, this I should skip because it's funny, but this is an example of lack of knowledge, okay? All these people who have come here and told us it would take too much land. Okay, well, this is probably the wrong audience because there's probably none of you here. But basically, I'm assumed someplace in Arizona, New Mexico, northern Mexico, where you have 250 kilowatt hours a year power. I talked to people at Tucson Electric, and they're using a 60% packing factor. So they're using 60% of the land is covered. And I'm assuming 10% efficient solar panels, because 10% is an easy number to make computations with. So that means that a square meter would produce 150 kilowatt hours per year, and a square kilometer would be 1.5 × 10⁸ kilowatt hours per year. Okay. Continuing the process, the United States consumes 3.7 times 10 to the 12th kilowatt hours per year, according to the CIA. So that's my source. So basically, it takes 9.52 times 10 to the third square miles, or basically 100 by 100 square of land to produce all the electricity consumed by the United States at the present time. So everybody from Livermore, et cetera, who's been telling us that it would take up a whole lot of land, they either haven't looked or they've been careless. Okay, well, what does that mean? I mean, is this a lot of land? Well, let's look at it compared to saying, let's compare it to ethanol. Ethanol uses up 10% of the U.S. corn crop, plus some of the sorghum. So I'll just stick to corn. Okay. So according to the state of Kansas on a website, 2.81 to the 10th of the 9th gallons of ethanol was produced. Oh, somehow there's a typo. And okay, there's a typo here, I'm sorry. Okay, basically it was 10 to the 9th. There are currently 80 million acres of land being used to produce corn. 10% of that is, there's 8 million acres of land currently used to produce corn. If we ignore the energy cost in producing ethanol, and according to the Department of Energy, it takes 100 BTU to produce 130 BTU of ethanol. Basically, a gallon of ethanol gross can produce 1.58 times 10 to the 4th BTU. So the total energy produced by ethanol is 1.46 times 10 to the 14th, or 1.46 times 10 to the 10th kilowatt hours. Okay, so basically, the punchline is that the U.S. is devoting 8 million acres of land, or 1.25 times 10 to the 4th square miles, to produce ethanol, and it only produces 1.15 times 10 to the minus 1 amount of energy, as just would be required compared to solar cells. Okay, now the punchline. Okay, I borrowed the Emerald's map, and here in red, for reasons I won't try to explain, is the amount of land that would be required to produce all the electricity the United States consumes using solar. And in blue is the amount of land that is being devoted to production of ethanol. And basically, and 1/100th of the amount of energy is being produced by ethanol than will be produced in solar. Okay. Now, as Ken said, and a lot of people said, the current budget for solar is on the order of less than 100 million. It's 80, was it? And at 54 cents a gallon, we are spending $1.5 billion subsidizing ethanol. And I hear from some sources that basically ethanol does nothing, because if you retune the car, it doesn't even reduce pollution. So somehow this country that can afford to spend $1.5 billion doing nothing is not spending the necessary resources to develop solar energy. And I'll take questions on that later. Okay. Now, going back to my first solar experience, this is the cost curve I would get for producing solar cells using the First Solar technology, using the numbers that First Solar gave me. And then Ken did a recent estimate of First Solar's cost at about 250 square meters. If I'm wrong, correct me. And his number was about $86.65. My model came out to $80.33. So we seem consistent. I think the difference is how we're handling packing. I think, but it's $6 for the difference. And I could see his number, and I think you can see mine by just modifying the labor cost a little bit. But what that says is that right now we're about here. But if we could get volume up, we could be down here in the neighborhood of $50 a square meter. And that's assuming current technology, no big innovations, nothing like producing glass on site. I think if we can do some things Ken has suggested in his calculations, we could get it to about $45 a square meter. But what it takes is volume. Okay. At this point, I will stop using my slides because all the other slides have been shown, and just make my punchline and give up my time. Basically, the only way solar is going to be efficient and economically viable is to get volume. If it doesn't have volume, it's going to be essentially special uses. The only way to get volume, not the only way, but in my opinion, the fastest way to get volume is to go and have large solar farms. Because large solar farms will use lots of panels. If you use lots of panels fast, you get learning by doing, you get the economies of scale, and essentially you can get electricity down to our previous forecast around 2.8 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, what stops us? Okay, first of all, we need somebody to take the plunge and start producing, plan a solar farm with the uncertainty that we don't know what the prices will be. The Saudis may drop the price of oil. We don't. So there's a risk involved. On the other hand, there are huge externalities. And one of the externalities is if we use the sort of learning curves, maybe I will show a learning curve. Come on. I've missed it, forget it. But if we show, if we use the learning curves, which you've seen before, and I'll just remind you, basically the labs, the real have assumed that basically doubling of output will reduce the cost of solar cells by 20%, and output is growing right now at 25% a year. If we could accelerate that, we could get the cost of solar to under 2 cents a kilowatt hour. If we got the cost of solar to under 2 cents a kilowatt hour, then essentially photovoltaic power would be an economically viable source of hydrogen for prices of gas in the neighborhood of $5 per 1,000 cubic feet. So the question is, we've got a chicken and egg problem, and somebody's got to furnish the egg. Thank you.
Okay, we wouldn't be having an objective conference if we didn't invite someone to talk about the economic barriers to solar, though I think some of the speakers have touched on a little bit. So we have Alex Barrell from Berkeley, and he is in the Energy and Resources group there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Amy. I will try to use this mic. The title of this conference is Energy and Nanotechnology Workshop, Prospects for Solar Energy in the 21st Century. And I've made a slight mistake in which I've taken the topic seriously and not restricted myself only to PV. I have really 3 pair. They're not grouped here, but these are the barriers that are not usually talked about. These are the ones that are mostly talked about by people who are not solar advocates, and these are the ones that are mostly talked about by solar advocates in documents such as this. Let me go through those. Like some of the other speakers that are going to have spoken this afternoon, some of what I've talked about has already been mentioned. First on costs. Manufacturing is one part of the cost that we've got. I think the most important thing to observe is there is no such thing as the cost of solar energy, because it varies so much with so many parameters. And I want you, if you can see this particular image, there's actually 3 different solar technologies here. There are the PV cells that are on the roof. You may not be able to see it, but there's a tram wall here, which is an architectural feature that can be used for space heating. And there's actually a downdraft solar cooling technology there. This is a visitor center in Zion National Park. The application, the competing resources or the competing energy services, and even the structure of costs for these technologies are all quite different. And they're quite different because this is basically a standalone system. It's not a grid-connected system, not a centralized system, doesn't really have to worry about the grid. And the costs also vary in location. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that what we think of as our costs are really quite complex. The industry seems to identify a number of things that I would label market access, which you can read. I don't need to read for you. But I would suggest that these really are effects and not causes. They certainly are things that have effects on the ground. Environmental impacts, some of these have already been discussed a little bit. Let me just mention in land use, so this is the threat some people see, or some people make, that, oh, we will have all these panels all over, this is a bad thing, and I don't know whether 100 by 100 square miles is a big area or a small area, but I would notice that there's two other things that you need to think about. One is how much land for transmission, and it really doesn't matter how much land, it's that it's in my backyard and you're not going to put it in my backyard. That may be solved or greatly relieved through the use of quantum wire or other technologies, but for now at least it may be an issue if you wanted to really have a lot of power generated in one part of the country and shipped all over. In addition, there's what I call life cycle impacts. Again, you may think this is not an issue. There should be a T there for toxics, I'm sorry. But some people do think it is important. Embodied energy, including the support structures. Again, some people think this is important and others not. Really, we get into the important challenges or the important barriers with this next bullet of intermittency and storage. And the problem is that the electric power industry is in the business where it is the ultimate in just-in-time delivery. That power has to be matched with demand at every second, essentially. To some degree, this may be a cost issue. But the cost comes in one of two ways. One is in either redundant capacity or storage systems. And let me just be clear about what drives the cost of an electric power system. What drives it to a large degree is that very hour of peak demand over the entire year. If your supply system cannot meet that, it does not work. At least that's the way that the electric power systems have been traditionally designed, traditionally priced, and traditionally operated. This means that the question that will always arise is, our peak demand is X gigawatts. You've got to ensure that I can meet X plus, usually 7% or 8% generation at any time with some reliability model. And the idea that we might need to use reliability models to think about these systems, I think, is maybe the next step in where we're going. It may be that in some cases this doesn't matter. Again, we vary greatly with application and technology. And this is a really small technology, just a light that you would put in your garden in your backyard. But it has all the storage that it needs. Will this get us to a couple terawatts that Marty Hoffert was suggesting? I doubt it by itself. But the idea is that compared to other technologies, there may be places where this intermittency does not matter so much. Also, in terms of land use, here's a piece of land that no one really uses, the roofs of this is a Lowe's in this case. And this may be something that's quite helpful because this is at the demand side as well. Probably the answer to this question depends on power system architecture and function. Exactly how is it designed and how does it work? And where we put these technologies will determine a lot about that interaction. One of the things that has not been mentioned very much is the security issue. And the security issue, there is actually a technical term called security in electric power systems, which is not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to what you probably are thinking of. Large-scale energy infrastructures can be quite vulnerable. We saw what happened with the blackout in the Northeast about a year and a month ago. For those of you who forget what it was that caused that blackout, there are essentially two things. One is, and I want to use as pejorative language as possible here, inadequate and nearly criminal, but not quite because there aren't statutes, but certainly inadequate maintenance of the monitoring systems by a number of energy companies, first. And second, trees. Yes, trees. The same power companies, some of them, simply didn't spend the money to trim the trees below their power lines. Trees grew into the power lines, began a process that they didn't realize was going out of control because their maintenance on their command and control systems was inadequate. The systems that we're talking about that might rely on these large farms will be vulnerable to some degree to some of those same problems. If we use DC, HVDC technologies, they're much smaller, but just remember that there are those issues. Lastly, what about demand response technologies? If you think demand response is part of the power system architecture, then I've already given you the answer. It is certainly not true that demand response technologies will solve the big problem. How do we get to terawatts of solar? But it could, on the margin, be quite important and maybe for a considerable amount of time. One of the interesting ideas that has come up already in terms of intermittency and storage is that we might use hydrogen. In fact, I'm working on a project we just started about actually only a few months ago funded by the National Science Foundation with people from Carnegie Mellon and University of Calgary, on what would an advanced energy distribution and transmission system look like, and in particular think about the question of when would we transmit either matter, whether it be hydrogen or perhaps a syngas with non-fossil carbon in it to make the transmission easier, versus transmitting energy either perhaps by microwaves or lasers, but more likely by electrons or really electromagnetic fields. What is it that would cause us to have to make this choice? Because you might not want to build two infrastructures, perhaps. When is it that we would face drivers that would cause us to make that choice, and what would be optimal choices under that condition? What's not so often talked about, although it's received some attention here, is the competition. And in particular, I want to stress something that Marty suggested and Alex and I were talking. The question is not resources. We've got all the resources we need for, say, 50 years or perhaps even 100 in this country to generate as much energy products and services as we want. We would soon, within a couple decades, turn to processing enormous amounts of coal to provide all those services, but we could do that. The real question is the climate change issue. We might solve it, maybe, with carbon capture and sequestration, but the point of mentioning this now is that the climate issue does not have the urgency that 9/11 did, the issue I brought up earlier, and several other people have suggested these sorts of crises are what is needed to create a condition under which an Apollo program might develop. So the potential, or rather the conditions needed for the types of investment that are probably needed in R&D as well as deployment do not exist, because the problem is not recognized, climate is not recognized as others. Wind, biomass, nuclear, and this is something that is really, I think, apparent in this conversation that we're having today. That one of the most important pieces of the competition is those other solar technologies. And in particular, I'm thinking solar technologies that might not be PV, solar technologies that might involve other advanced materials or might involve simply design changes. And I think the idea that I've heard, I obviously put this slide together a couple of days ago, it's quite clear, listening to folks talk here, that this is a zero-sum game. We need to grow the pie, but we need to grow the pie in my direction more than the other direction. And there are several things, in particular, research funding, how much we can interest the consumers, and how much the investors might be willing to pony up. This is really one of the most important, I think, obstacles we've got. And without changing this, I think just what Marty called the fratricide in this community will allow these guys to keep moving, because the point of this slide is they all do keep getting better. Let me spend most of my time, or most of my remaining time here on the political economy of electricity. We've already heard that perhaps the next series of meeting, or next meeting in this series will be about the grid. I think that's right on the money. This is the most important problem, I think. We have a classic public choice problem in a way. The winners are small and diffuse. For the most part, the winners are consumers or companies that have a relatively small stake in the electric power business. That's because, with very, very few exceptions, there's a pretty sharp distinction between companies that are in the electric power industry and companies that are in other parts of the energy industries. And the losers are the electric power industry, the utility companies for the most part, who are fairly large and fairly focused on this particular issue. And so a good example of how this works out is with this technology, this home PV technology. When you put in a home PV technology and you get a lot of electricity generated during the middle of the afternoon when it's quite warm, you reduce the air conditioning demand. You reduce the electricity required to support air conditioning, which means less generation. We all know that. But if done in large enough scales, you also would presumably reduce the amount of transmission and distribution that would be needed to support the generation to bring the power to the air conditioner at that home. And under current policies, that benefit, which is produced by the investment, presumably by the homeowner, perhaps by the state, onto that system flows not to the investor there, but to the incumbent utility or the incumbent transmission owner. And there's a classic example of the differences that we have. It's a high capital, low operating cost business. Therefore, it's quite sensitive to lending rates. And one reason why I think this is a very challenging application is this raises the cost of down payment. And what builders try and do is lower the cost of down payment. And this is a fundamental, now we're getting away from these causes that we saw before to what are really the fundamental reason. I'm sorry, we're getting away from the effects that we saw before to really fundamental causes of the problems. And it's just the structure of this. One of the things that is perhaps rather troubling are three trends that will exacerbate this middle bullet point. That is upcoming beginning of major retirement of the baby boomers, the U.S. budget deficit and the U.S. trade deficit, all of which point towards much higher interest rates for quite some time, which will make any type of technology with this sort of financial structure much less attractive. But probably the most important thing is that PV in particular, all solar technologies, but in particular PV, threatens the thing that is the most valuable thing in the world to the most powerful players in the electric power industry. It threatens the utility monopoly on electricity sales. Nothing else is more important. Not even money is more important, because the monopoly franchise is a lot of money for a long time. And it does that because of some of the things that are also beneficial. It facilitates basically small projects. These small projects are have relatively high cost to control or build. Often you really can't control them. Most importantly, perhaps, they're consumer-owned. Now the utility companies will begin to see, if this was to become deployed widely, more and more people competing in their core industry, which they do not want to have at all. I mentioned this problem with generation and transmission. It may be the case, in fact, that to solve the really big problem that terawatts of climate-friendly or terawatts of carbon-free energy, we may need to solve or break this problem in the future. One of the advantages of the centralized solar electricity model that was just discussed is it doesn't have this particular problem. So if you think that this is a problem you don't want to solve, then don't use this model. Use the previous speaker's suggestions. Marty Hoffert I think he was going to denigrate this more than he did. I just wanted to point out that one suggestion by Pakala and Sokolow is we need to invest over the next 50 years in what they call the stabilization wedge, which can be thought of 7 slices, and each slice yields 1 gigaton per year of avoided carbon. Whether or not it's 7 or 30, I don't want to really argue with. It's just a convenient scale. They also note that 1 slice of solar electricity it would require the installation of 40 gigawatts peak per year, which is 20 times the current capacity. And one can wonder if this is in fact a feasible opportunity. And so I put this question as the obstacles to what? I don't think there's any obstacle to growing solar industry. I don't think there's any obstacle to supplying at least countries that can pay for it with energy. The real obstacles are to supplying energy in a way that does not cause dramatic amounts of climate change. While this is quite an adventure here, this is quite a way to think about it. Remember that building that had the tram wall and the air conditioning unit, whether all solar technologies put together could in fact meet some challenge like this, or maybe even some larger challenge, may not be quite so difficult. But without addressing some of the things I've talked about in this presentation, it'd probably be impossible. Thank you.
Okay, since we are a session on solar, I didn't want to end with the barriers. So now we have Gregor Shish, who will talk to us about the European experience and the potential in Europe.
Yes, while we were waiting for my presentation, I want to say something. First, I was asked to tell something about the bright future of solar energy in the US. I answered I'm not able to do that because I not in detail studied the USA, but I studied in detail the European situation. But I hope that after my speech, the listeners will be able to transfer somehow to the US, and I'm quite sure that you can do so. Yeah, that's the problem. Huh? We will need a while. Yeah, okay.
No? You guys see something thicker when I walk over?
Where's the... Ah, yeah, here it is.
It's loaded. We're loading it.
Oh, there.
So, okay, we are there. I don't see very good from here, but I hope you see what you have to see. So, I'm talking about a low-cost but totally renewable electricity supply for Europe and its close proximity. This will lead us to the question, is it possible to come to a totally renewable electricity supply? And I will answer that. Yes, it is possible. And it is possible with the existing technology. The next question is, can we afford that? And again, I want to answer that we can afford that. It's not very expensive. It's quite cheap if we do it right, properly. And then I want to give an idea how this could work in an optimal case. And the best solution is if we erect a spacious HVDC network which combines all the production areas with the areas of storages which are still there. And therefore, with such a system, we come to a relatively cheap electricity supply. Now I want to go in details. I want to start with hydropower. There are two different types normally differentiated. The one is the runoff river type, which produces the electricity when the water comes down to the power plant. And the other one is the storage type. And this is interesting because with the storage power type, you can produce electricity when you need it. And the storages normally have sizes to store the electricity production of the plant for 2-3 months, up to half a year. So it's a huge storage volume, and nearly nobody really knows how big it is because nobody did care about that. But we can find this data, and I put it together, some of the data. Here you see the capacity of the UCTE storage hydropower plants. UCTE is the big Western European electricity network. The storage capacity is 57 terawatt hours, and the annual production is 86 terawatt hours. So the storage capacity is about 2/3 of the total annual production. Similar, but even more interesting, is the hydropower storage in Norway and Scandinavia. In the Nordel network, the power is about the same, but the storage capacity is much bigger and the production as well. Ah, yes.
Oops. Sorry about the interruption here.
No problem.
Thank you.
And if we put both together, we find a huge capacity, a huge storage capacity as well, and about 15% of the total production in the UCTE and Nordel network. It's about enough. The storage capacity is big enough to store the electricity for 1.2 months of the whole area. One back. I want to show something about the worldwide capacity. Here we see the worldwide gross hydropower potential. If we now look where the hydropower plants are right now, we see that in the first world countries, like in Europe, most of the capacities are used already. So from a European point of view, we find some capacities here in the Caucasian area or in the Ural area or in the northern part of Scandinavia. Or we can also have a look down to Africa. If we look here in North America, we find a similar situation. In the USA, you used quite a lot of your potentials, but there are some potentials left in north and south of the USA, which might be interesting to use later. So this is about these potentials. Here might be the world's best place for a hydropower station, which could produce, in average, about 50 gigawatts all over the year. That's average production. So it's one of the most interesting hydropower places. It's not erected now because it could provide more energy more electricity than whole Africa needs today. So it's far too big for to install it here in Africa. So now back, I come to the solar power plants, solar thermal power plants. I don't know if everybody knows it. You have a mirror field, and the direct radiation is concentrated on a fluid which transports the heat to a conventional thermal power plant. And what is very interesting with this kind of power plants is that the heat out of the collector can directly flow into the conventional power plant and produce electricity, but it can also be stored in a thermal storage with a very high efficiency, and then later on, for example, in the night, produce electricity. So you have here the possibility to produce the electricity when you need it. That's very important to know. Here we see the potential heat production out of this mirror fields worldwide. And if we look from a European point of view, we find this is the most interesting area here. And this is enough to produce about 700 times the EU electricity consumption. So it's a very big potential there. A comparable area you have got in the USA down to Mexico. It's not so big, but it's big enough for America, no problem. But not only the potentials are interesting, but also the behavior of the production. And here we see the relation between the December production and the July production. So what we can see is that there are some areas in the intertropic convergence zone where you find about the same production in our winter or summertime. This is because the rain time in our summer comes up and the production declines a bit, and therefore you have this quite stable production over the whole time. If we look to the USA, then you would have to find an arrangement with Mexico to get similar possibilities. Now I want to come to the wind energy. Again, also here, the potentials. We see from a European point of view, we have quite good potentials here in Europe, but they are very strongly restricted. Their use is strongly restricted by the high population density. But there is a belt around Europe with very good potentials from Western Siberia down to the west coast of Africa, where we find very good potentials and which are almost empty. Nobody's living there. It's deserts and things like that. So they might be free to use for wind power production. Again, here, a very important question is how does the production behave? And what we see here is that Europe is a... oh, wait, I want to say something about the situation in the US. Here we see very good conditions in the Great Plains. What you not see, I don't know how good you know the potentials in the US. There are some potentials missing that are the very excellent potentials in very rough, hilly areas. They are not covered with this data because I don't want to go into details, but you just have to know that these data are rather conservative. Now back to the fluctuation, the seasonal fluctuation. We see that in Europe, Europe as a whole is a winter wind region. So we would have to work together with Northern Africa to get summer wind regions with high potential in our for our electricity supply. The US has both together, the summer as the winter wind regions. So it's quite a good situation for the USA. I want to go a bit into detail with this area. If I only select the places where we can produce more than 1,500 full load hours from the windmills, that's about 17% of capacity factor, then that's about 40% of the whole area. And we install the wind power at a normal installation rate, then we can produce about 120 to 240,000 terawatt hours from this area. And if we compare that with the electricity consumption in UCTE and Nordel, we find us with about 100 times the electricity which we possibly could produce from this area, only selecting the better wind sites. If I only would choose the best sites and would search for how much of the area we would need to cover whole of the electricity supply of UCD and Nordel, then we would find us with about 4% of the total area which we would have to use. 0.4, sorry, 0.4%. If we would want to supply the whole area, we would still be able to produce about 50 times the electricity consumption in this area. So it's a huge potential, and I want to go further with my example. I selected some areas here in Europe, some in Western Siberia and Northern Russia, in Kazakhstan, as well as in Mauritania and in southern Morocco. But before I go into detail here, I want to show you how conservative in some cases the data are. We may need that later. Yes, the area where you saw the red circle is about this area. It's in Egypt, and this is a detailed study of the potentials. And they show that the actual production in this area would be about 3 times as high as I can see that from my data. It's a very hilly, very steep area, and the RISE found out that there are places with more than 6,000 full load hours production, and this area would easily hold for 20 gigawatts of wind power. So it's this is just a very extreme example, but you will find many of these kind of examples. So now back to this example. If I look at the production of the European selection, then I find a maximum in February, and it declines rapidly to May, June, August, the production from wind energy. And the fluctuation is much stronger than the fluctuation of the electricity consumption, which is quite stable. So these two curves don't fit very well together. This is true also for southern Morocco, yes, but the behavior is totally different. The peaks are in summer when we have the minimum. So the idea is not far away to combine the production of all of these areas, and then we arrive at this. With this very simple example, we arrive at this curve. So these curves do fit quite well together. So how I am in time? I have to decide what I want to show.
10 minutes.
I have left 10 minutes? Or? Okay, so I think I directly have to go on. Yes. What about transmission. We saw that it's very interesting to use this faraway areas, but can we transport the electricity? And the answer is yes, but the situation is similar as in the US. If you look at the current network, you find that there are some bottlenecks. For example, if we would like to transport electricity from Northern Africa to Spain, we find that with 350 megawatts, which will soon be enlarged to 1.4 gigawatts. That's not a lot of capacity. The next bottleneck would be between Spain and France. And so we see this kind of network is not sufficient to transport huge amounts of electricity. But as we heard today, there is a solution which is in use and which is quite cheap and has low losses. That's the HVDC transmission. I want to show you calculations what this means if we engage this technology and transport electricity from wind power over far distances. We need some figures that we don't go into details here. Just 2 days figures, no learning curves within there. It's just what we would have to pay today for that technologies. Then, if we look to southern Morocco, we find us with at least 3,400 full-hour hours wind energy production, which means that the cost of electricity there would be about 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And if we would transmit that to the city where I'm living in, 4,400 kilometers away from the point of production, then we would find us with total electricity costs of 4.5 euro cents per kilowatt hour, whereof 0.5 cents are for the transmission losses, only the losses, the cost of the losses. So 1 cent is for the transmission line, 0.5 is for the losses of 10% over this distance. If we compare that with the cost of electricity from wind power in Germany, we find that either of these areas could deliver cheaper electricity to Germany than Germany can produce from wind power. So, but now begins the interesting part. I have shown some potentials of different renewable energies, and I have shown a simple example. But now the question is, how would you put together a new electricity supply out of biomass, wind power, existing hydropower, PV, solar thermal power plants, and the transmission line. And therefore, I divided this area in sub-areas, and for each of them, I defined how big the potential is, how the hourly production of each of the technologies is, and from where to where I could lay the transmission line. And then it's a question of a mathematical optimization to find the best solution. And that's what I ask the optimization. And after the optimization process, every power line has a certain capacity. Some are not built, others have very high capacities. And we come, that's the base case scenario, where only 2 days technology are included at 2 days costs. So no learning curves. It's really very conservative calculation. And we end up with an electricity supply at 4.6 euro cents per kilowatt hour. That's what's possible with 2 days technology. What we see here is that the whole production is dominated by wind power. Almost 70% of the production comes from wind power. And the wind power needs backup. And this is provided by the hydropower, the existing hydropower, mainly the storage type, and by biomass. Both of them provide backup, and a little part of the backup, also at today's costs, would be provided by solar thermal power plants. Photovoltaic is not used. It's just expensive to reduce the costs, and the optimization doesn't ask if it likes photovoltaics. It's just asked for the price. That's, yeah, I could mention about 40% of the total production is transported over the HVDC line, and this produces a loss of 4% of the total production. And then we have here some excess production, so production which cannot be used in the time it is produced. And this is also only about 4%, so it's not so inefficient. The system is quite efficient. So it's a question how to put all the pieces together to find a good solution, and this is the solution for this base case scenario. So here again we find this base case scenario. It's the on the left side, the one. And now I can ask different questions. For example, what would happen if I wouldn't allow to transmit electricity between the areas, these regions? Yes. Then some regions can't provide themselves with energy, enough energy, and therefore we need some backup system. And I calculated with, in this case, very cheap hydrogen, and the hydrogen has to be used as a backup system, a further backup system, and the costs go up very steep. It's about 2 times the cost in some areas, and almost 2 times all over the whole area. Then also offshore wind energy is used in some areas because it's cheaper than other possibilities. So that's this result. And I like to call this a decentralized scenario, but it's not really decentralized because the regions have 90 million people and they are connected with each other, so it's not decentralized. But you can imagine what happens if you really think about a decentralized production. I think it will be incredibly expensive. So then I searched for the costs which have to be reached that photovoltaics come into the game. And I found that at 1/8 of the 2 days costs of photovoltaics, then it would contribute a little bit to the production. And interesting, it would be only used at the intertropical convergence zone, and the electricity would be transported over 4.5 or 5,000 kilometers to the north to the demand centers. Then what happens if I again divide it to 2, the cost of photovoltaics? We arrive at 1/16 of the costs. So this is about 26 euro per watt peak. 26? Wait, no. It's very cheap. I calculated with 5,000 euro per kilowatt peak. So now it's 1/16 of that. It's very low. Yes, I doubt that we ever can reach that. But then photovoltaics would play an important role. Next question is what would happen if we would be able to reduce the costs of solar thermal power plants, just the mirror field costs to 1/2 of the 2 days cost. And then you see that the solar thermal power plants are quite close to the edge where they really expand. So it's a technology which is close to economic standard. So I think I shouldn't go through all of them and go on with the next one to some conclusions. I think we have to compare the costs of such electricity supply with the right figure, and I think the right figure is the gross domestic product, the national economy. How high would the costs be for the national economy? And as I told the costs of electricity would be about 4.6 euro cents per kilowatt hour. Yes, this is about 1.1% of the gross domestic product which we would have to spend on this electricity. Today, we spend 2.2% of our gross domestic product on electricity. We don't have to compare these two figures. We have to compare with this figure, we have to compare the production only, not the delivery and what else is between makes the higher cost. So we have the 2 days production costs, which are around 0.8% of the gross domestic product today, with this 1.1%. And we find us with excess costs of 0.3% of our gross domestic product. And at this point, I think nobody can tell me that we can't afford that. It's the growth of 1 month, of 1 good month. So that's almost nothing. So we don't have technological problems, we don't have economical problems, we only have political problems. That's my answer to this question. So I'm quite sure that it's possible to reduce the costs of renewable energies quite well. And I'm therefore also quite sure that it is possible to erect a cheaper electricity supply with renewable energies, even with existing technology. And if there are some new technologies, and I think there are some very interesting ideas, then it could look even nicer than that. So now I come to the conclusions. There are enough renewables for our needs. The bigger the catchment area, the better the temporal behavior of the production. Backup and storage are existent to a certain extent. The grid must be reinforced to come to a cheap solution. The cost of HVDC lines would not dominate, and also of the backup would not dominate the costs. Oops. So renewable energy could become a major source of our electricity supply. And again, the costs would not be a problem. For Europe, I think this renewable electricity supply offers a chance for other kind of cooperation with the poorer country in the south of Europe. This does not really so good apply to the USA because you only have one southern neighbor, but maybe also an incentive. There is cooperation of scientists which promote this idea of a trans-Mediterranean renewable energy cooperation. And back to the USA, to North America, I think the conditions here might be even better than in Europe, also from the technical point of view. But they might be much better if I look at the political problems, because we would have to arrange to work with 60, 70 countries together, and you can do most of all by yourself, and if you take with you your northern and your southern neighbor, you have reached the game. So I think it's much easier if Northern America starts with that project and shows that it works, and I'm quite convinced that it works.
Well, that was very interesting, so I'm going to open the floor for discussion and questions.
First one here for the last speaker. So I wish it were that easy. I believe that the issue is that there's a fundamental flaw in the argument. The issue is that this was predicated upon very large resource bases of inexpensive wind energy. You had 270,000 terawatt hours in a year in a relatively small region. I think that's simply physically in error. The solar constant's only 10 to the 5th terawatts. That's known. only 0.1% of the solar energy couples to the wind over the entire planet. So there's only 100 terawatts total instantaneous of wind energy everywhere. The issue is, so there can't be 27 terawatts or 270 terawatts in a tiny corner of the boundary layer just of Europe, is that when you take the instantaneous point measurement of the wind energy at one spot, and then you multiply it by the entire area over a very large wind field, you end up calculating that there's more energy to be harvested than there is in the wind boundary layer hitting that field in the first place. And the larger the area you calculate, the more you overestimate the resource. So I think that physics shows the resource has been highly overestimated here, and so there's just not enough wind, no matter what its price, to supply 10 terawatts of energy on the planet. That may be wrong, but I think the physics clearly shows that's right. And if that's right, then it doesn't matter what the wind costs. There's simply not enough of it. And then the numbers change completely.
I think your assumptions are totally wrong. Okay. Because not 0.1% of the solar radiation are converted to wind energy, sure. It's 3%. And this you can find everywhere in the literature. When I calculate with my data, I come up with about 2.2%. So my data are very conservative, as you already heard from me. So your assumption is wrong. If your assumption was right, I would give you right. That's a problem if the physics wouldn't allow for so much production. But I'm not so stupid. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that we certainly have to get.
Come up to a
Marty knows the number.
I mean, there's some controversy about how much wind energy there is. A lot of it depends on what altitudes you're at and how big the frontal area is. And even more so when you're starting to harvest large amounts of wind energy, whether you feed back on the climate system. I mean, all the energy in the wind is ultimately dissipated anyway. What you hope is that you intervene before it's dissipated and have it turn your electrical generators. But I have another, by the way, found that a fascinating presentation, and I think attempts to refute you could actually generate a tremendous amount of information, because you're actually dealing with the problem of whether we can use existing technology to renewably power a certain part of the world. Now, the other thing is that Europe already is much better than the rest of the world in terms of the energy per unit GDP. And a lot of that has to do with exporting the production and the carbon emissions to places like China, which are above the world average. So it seems to me that the more you're already efficient, the harder it might get to be more efficient. But there's a more fundamental thing. One of the reasons your system works, I think, is because Europe is very well endowed with mountains, and you have a lot of potential hydro and actual hydro storage. Unless I'm mistaken, I think Switzerland is huge in terms of its hydro. In much of the rest of the world, hydro is saturated, and I don't know whether you're talking about reappropriating those hydro resources for storage and using new transmission lines to create a new transmission and storage system that would address the problem of intermittency. It seems like that might be the dominant technology of your system.
Hydropower is very necessary in the system, you're right. And I prepared for that question because I also wanted to know how good the conditions are in North America. And I found that 13% of the electricity produced in North America are produced from hydropower. That's about the same figure as for my huge area. In the EU itself, it's a higher proportion, but I calculated all the scenarios for the huge area, so it's quite the same. But I think you have much more hydropower potentials left, which could be used, than we do. So I think also this situation might be better for Northern America than for us. You have a higher electricity consumption. if I take the NAFTA region, you come up with 4,500 terawatt hours today. That's your today's production. The scenario area I calculated has about 4,000, so it's almost the same consumption also. So I hope I could answer your questions.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, well, I think it's time for a cup of coffee and a stretch of the legs. And then we'll come back here at, wait, you got the thing there? What time, 4 o'clock? Yeah, 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock, we'll come back and talk about thermal solar.